right, welcome everyone. We are so happy to see folks in this room in person for our 2022 Constitution Day at the University of Pittsburgh. The law school is always honored to host this event for the university. I have to tell you, it's one of my favorite days. It is an opportunity to bring a very distinguished, high impact, influential speaker and scholar in this space that is dear to many of our hearts. So Constitution Day is actually one of those federal holidays that was established to recognize September 17, 1787 as the day that constitutional delegates signed the Constitution in Philadelphia. And we celebrate it as we are required to do by federal law, but we do so enthusiastically, especially when we are able to have such esteemed scholars as we do today. So with that welcome, I am going to turn it over to our dean and fearless leader, Amy Wildermuth, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for everything you did to put together the day today. I want to also thank our great Pitt Law team, Amy Change, Corey, Deb, everybody hanging around and helping us out to make this a reality. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce my friend, Richard Albert. He is the William Stamps Farish Professor in Law, Professor of Government, and Director of Constitutional Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. He writes about constitutional reform, including amendment, replacement, and revolution. Professor Albert's accomplishments are many, so rather than take the entire time allotted for this lecture to tell you everything he has done, and yes, it would take that long, so incredible is his record, I'm going to offer just a few highlights. Professor Albert has authored or co-authored over 20 books, as well as numerous scholarly articles and chapters. He serves as an editor or on the editorial board for a wide array of publications, including many based in other countries. His publications have been translated into Bahasa, Chinese, French, Hungarian, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. His 2019 book, Constitutional Amendments, Making, Breaking, and Changing Constitutions, was published by Oxford University Press and has received numerous accolades, including being featured on Jotwell, the journal of things we like lots. In addition to being a prolific author, Professor Albert serves on a wide array of committees and organizations, including as the co-president of the International Society of Public Law. He also created the Academic Diversity Pledge, which is dedicated to making the legal academy more diverse, more inclusive, and more equitable in the distribution of academic opportunities available to scholars and students in all areas of legal study. And he is the foundation and director of the International Forum on the Future of Constitutionalism, whose mission it is to marshal knowledge and experience to build a world of opportunity, liberty, and dignity for all. His many contributions have not gone without notice. He has won the prize awarded by the American Society of Comparative Law for the most outstanding article on comparative law by a scholar under 40.
That was a long time ago.
Long time ago. In 2018, he was awarded the Thurgood Marshall Leadership Award by the Thurgood Marshall Legal Society. He has twice won the Anthony P. Farley Award for excellence in teaching, and he has been recognized as one of the top 50 under 50, which I still think is true, by the way, minority law professors in the United States. He has held visiting professorships all over the world at the best academic institutions. Professor Albert, who apparently never sleeps, is known for his dedication to his work and particularly his mission to change our collective approach and thinking on amending constitutions. His commitment to making a real and meaningful difference around the globe and supporting other academics, especially early career diverse scholars. But even this does not fully capture Professor Albert. So I asked our mutual friend, Vic Amar, the dean at the University of Illinois, what makes Professor Albert so special. And he said, in addition to being a prolific scholar, a consummate classroom teacher, and a devoted colleague, he is as loyal and giving a friend as anyone could have. And in a world characterized by intolerant discord, he is always kind and respectful of other people, even those with whom he disagrees. Professor Albert is really a class act and a role model for young legal professionals. Well said, Dean Amar, who, in my book, always says it better than the rest of us. It is a real honor today to have Professor Albert here today for his talk, The Constitution America Could Have Had, for Pitt Law's celebration of Constitution Day. I hope you will join me in warmly welcoming Professor Albert.
Thank you. That was so nice. And he's amazing. Thank you very much. What a nice touch. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Happy Constitution Day. You can say it back to me.
Happy Constitution Day.
I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Pitt for this invitation to mark this important day. Thank you so much, Amy, Dean Wildermuth, for this magnificent introduction. My mother is watching, so thank you. Hi, Mom. I want to thank Professor Debbie Brake for hosting me and for our lovely dinner last night with some of the Pitt faculty. Thanks to Amy Change, who helped to make this happen and go so smoothly. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's so good to be with you, and I'm happy to be here. Today, I want to ask you 3 questions. And each question is going to feature a major player in American constitutional history. And each question will highlight one big reform that each of these major players suggested for the U.S. Constitution. First, we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson. He proposed a solution to the problem of constitutional paralysis, even before the Constitution became unamendable as it is today. Second, we'll talk about James Madison. He proposed a way for the country to reconcile its racist and sexist beginnings with its aspirations to be a just society. And third, Abraham Lincoln. He proposed to make something in the Constitution unchangeable, unalterable, permanent, forever and all times. My remarks are entitled, The Constitution America Could Have Had, because the country came very close to having a constitution that differs dramatically from the one that you have today. I want to suggest that Jefferson and Madison both had the right idea, but that Lincoln was dead wrong. And I look forward to hearing your own views, because I understand there's time for Q&A and discussion after my remarks. So Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, George Washington, you recognize these names, just 3 of the 36 signatories to the Constitution. That's what we're here today to commemorate, the day when they signed the Constitution, the document that would later become the Constitution that has endured for over 2 centuries. That's a remarkable lifespan for a Constitution to live, 235 years since it was written, 234 since it was ratified, 233 since it came into force. No other constitution in the world has survived as long, no other constitution is older, and no constitution in the world has been as influential as the U.S. Constitution. When it was created 2 centuries ago, it inaugurated a brand new technology for governance. It introduced an innovative architecture of the separation of powers, a unique method for presidential selection, and a bold new vision for the role of courts. At the time, the Constitution was ahead of its time. But today the Constitution is well past its prime. What was at the time thought to be revolutionary is today, by many, seen as outdated, archaic, and undemocratic. I think most everyone, ask yourself the question, I think most everyone believes that there's at least one thing urgently in need of reform in the U.S. Constitution. Some want to change how the president is elected. They believe it's necessary to discard the Electoral College and to move instead to a national popular vote. That might be your view. Others set their sights on the U.S. Senate. They want to rebalance the voting power of states according to population, because right now the Constitution guarantees 2 senators to each state, no matter how populous or deserted that state is, which means that whether you live among 40 million people in California or 600,000 people in Wyoming, you have the same representation in the Senate. That might be your view too. Still, others believe that the Constitution does not protect the rights. So they call for the Constitution to protect a certain kind of new right that we see all around the world, what we call positive rights, because the U.S. Constitution protects mostly negative rights. Negative rights are restrictions on what the government can do. The government cannot restrict your freedom of assembly, your freedom of expression, of religious belief. Negative rights. Other countries, they will impose positive, affirmative obligations on the state to help improve the lives of their citizens. You get a right to a job in some constitutions, a right to health care, a right to a house, believe it or not. These are the kinds of positive rights that we see in newer constitutions. None of these appear in the U.S. Constitution. And so for these and other reasons, that's why many people today say that the Constitution does not serve the country as well as it could. That's not a controversial claim. I'm not here to be controversial. It's the point that is no constitution is perfect. Each and every one of them could be written better, could perform better. Because as well-intentioned as the authors of any constitution might be, the simple reality is that no one knows how the Constitution will work when it is enacted. It takes time and experience to reveal flaws and errors that might someday need to be corrected. And that's why virtually every single constitution in the world makes it possible to fix the problems in that constitution as they arise. Constitutions have these procedures for constitutional amendment. The U.S. has its own procedure for amendment. And so if people want to fix the problems that you perceive, whatever that is, or those are in the Constitution, there's a vehicle to do that. They can amend the Constitution. You can amend your Constitution. But that's really much easier said than done, because Article 5 of the Constitution tells us that an amendment requires 2/3 approval in both houses of Congress, along with the approval of 3/4 of the states. Congress can't even pass a law. Imagine requiring 2/3. So getting that level of supermajority agreement is difficult, even in the best of times, which means that now, when the country is perhaps at its most divided since the Civil War era, that level of supermajority agreement is not possible. And so scholars, I think, quite rightly agree, I agree, that the U.S. Constitution is probably the world's most difficult to amend. Across American history, there have been 12,000 proposals to amend the U.S. Constitution, but only 27 have been ratified. 27 out of 12,000 is not a good batting average. Those are not good odds to getting your amendment passed. In fact, the odds are higher that you will win a prize if you play the Powerball lottery. The odds are higher that you'll be called to come on down if you go to the Price is Right recording studio. The odds are higher that you'll earn a perfect score on the SAT. that you'll be audited by the IRS. And the odds are higher that if you're single in this room, you're dating a millionaire. So as you can see, it's very difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution. If you like the Constitution as it currently is, then all is right in your world. You win. Congratulations. But if you don't like the Constitution as it currently is in its present form, then you feel stuck in a straitjacket. You probably feel powerless to make things right because you don't see your own values mirrored in the text of your Constitution. If that describes you, you're not alone, because Americans across the entire spectrum of political thought tell us that there's something they would change about the Constitution, whether you're left, right, or center. Not too long ago, the National Constitution Center, in this state, by the way, in Philly, brought together 3 groups of scholars to create their ideal versions of the U.S. Constitution. Each group presented a different set of ideas for what they would change in the current Constitution. Each group also represented a different political orientation. There was a group that was self-described as libertarian, one self-described as progressive, and one self-described as conservative. Every single group said they'd make dozens of changes to the current Constitution. Here's just a few of the ideas that each group suggested. The libertarian camp chose to clamp down on the Commerce Clause, to introduce stronger protections against eminent domain, and to impose a balanced budget requirement. Interesting. The progressive camp would codify a general right to vote, which does not exist in the Constitution today. They would replace life tenure for judges with a single 18-year term, and they would put into the Constitution explicit protections for equality according to gender identity and sexual orientation. The conservative camp would reduce the size of the Senate, limit the president to a single 6-year term, and make it easier to amend the Constitution. These are just a few items that each of the 3 camps suggested they would want to do if they had the power to just change the Constitution. The point is not that one group is right, I'm not suggesting that at all. The point is that everyone has something that they want to change about the Constitution, no matter your political views. But the problem is that everyone, you, have to resign yourselves to the reality that the Constitution is frozen. Today, the Constitution is unchangeable, it is unamendable, because it's so hard to do. There was a solution, actually, to America's problem of constitutional paralysis long before the Constitution became unamendable. And that solution was proposed by Thomas Jefferson. I'll tell you about the solution in a moment, but let me first tell you about what prompted Jefferson's solution. Jefferson was concerned about 2 problems. He worried that the Constitution would become permanent because Americans would grow to love their Constitution too much. That they would come to see the Constitution as a holy, hallowed, and sacrosanct symbol of American nationhood. So much so that they would not ever want to change the Constitution, even if it was an urgent need of reform. Here's Jefferson making this point in his own words 2 centuries ago. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. Jefferson continues, they ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and they suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. End of quote. That's Jefferson. That captures perfectly, doesn't it, how Americans, perhaps you, perceive the Constitution today. It actually helps to explain why it's so hard to amend. Jefferson feared that this would happen before the Constitution actually came into force. He worried that you would feel like you must keep the Constitution you have inherited from the founders. There was also a practical reason why Jefferson wanted to avoid the problem of a sacred Constitution. And that is that for him, it made little sense to use an old technology to address modern challenges. He believed that a constitution must be adapted to the needs and values of the present moment. Here's Jefferson now making that point. Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. Jefferson continues, we might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him as a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their ancestors. That's Jefferson. That's Jefferson explaining the problem. And this brings us now to Jefferson's proposed solution. A brilliant solution, if I can allow myself to editorialize. I've been trying to avoid that. For Jefferson, the cause of the problem is Constitution worship. And the consequence of the problem is constitutional paralysis. Here's his solution. He proposed that the Constitution should require each and every generation to choose for itself whether or not to reform the Constitution. Not just you talking around the water cooler with friends and family. No, you'd have to go to the ballot box and make a forced choice. You'd have to make this choice every single generation, which for Jefferson meant every 20 years. Here's the choice that he wanted you to make. You'd be asked every 20 years the following question. Do you want to keep your Constitution as it is? Or do you want to revise it in some way? If you say you want to revise it, then a convention is convened where you get to work on revising it. And Jefferson believed that forcing people to make this choice was a way to prevent them from just passively accepting the old Constitution that they inherited as their own. In the end, the U.S. Constitution was, of course, not designed in the way Jefferson suggested. But many state constitutions across the country have adopted Jefferson's proposal. They require that the people, every generation, must decide affirmatively whether to revise their constitution or to keep it as it is. Alaska does this, Illinois does this, Maryland, New Hampshire, New York, Ohio, Rhode Island. Connecticut does this as well. Here's what the text of the Connecticut Constitution says about this 20-year rule. Shall there be a constitutional convention to amend or revise the Constitution of the state? That's it. But you have to do it. You have to answer that question when you go to vote every 20 years. If a majority of voters says yes, the Connecticut General Assembly has to convene a constitutional convention to reform the Constitution. Now imagine if voters across the United States were asked every 20 years whether and how they want to amend their Constitution. And imagine that Congress would have to act if the people said yes. Congress doesn't have to do anything now. There are polls that say we want to change this or that about the Constitution, but nothing happens. Congress would have to do something. Do you think presidents would continue to be selected according to an antiquated electoral college? Maybe. But you have to confront that decision. Would the right to abortion now be expressly protected in the text of the Constitution? Maybe. Would there be a balanced budget amendment? Maybe. You see, the genius in Jefferson's solution is that it breaks through the stalemate in Congress, the stalemate that prevents serious consideration and serious action on constitutional reform. Because the Jeffersonian proposal inserts a concrete expression of popular views into the equation, which means that Congress effectively has no choice but to heed the call of the people for constitutional change if the people call for it. And so that's Jefferson's proposal. It's to pre-program the Constitution, to put a clause in there that says you have to have this vote every 20 years. And it's worked in the states because their constitutions are not seen as untouchable. Think of the Pennsylvania Constitution. You might know a bit about it, but do you revere it? Do you venerate it as you do the U.S. Constitution? They're not seen as sacred, and they're amended much more regularly than the U.S. Constitution. And that may be why, in some cases, they better represent the needs and hopes and preferences of the people that they govern. And so now you know about the Jeffersonian proposal. So here's my first question to you for you to think about. If you could wave a magic wand, would you insert this Jeffersonian rule of periodic constitutional revision into the U.S. Constitution? Sometimes states are the site of solutions to national problems. That's one of the main benefits of America's federal system. States become the venue for policies and programs that can later be expanded to the national level. That's what U.S. Supreme Court Justice Brandeis meant when he called states laboratories for social and economic experimentation. And in fact, states have often led the country in constitutional innovations on matters of civil and political rights. But here's something, Amy, Debbie, everyone, here's something I never thought I would say about a state constitution, let alone about this particular one I'm going to tell you about. The Constitution of Alabama is today doing more than the U.S. Constitution to reflect the promise of a society rooted in justice, fairness, and equality. Would you believe that? How can it be that the Alabama Constitution is the standard to which I'm suggesting, or will suggest, that the U.S. Constitution should aspire? How can that be? After all, the Constitution of Alabama of 1901 has long been rooted in racism, hate, and exclusion. That's the reason it was written in 1901, was to impose segregation. It did it best at the time to stop progress toward a true equality in the state. Let me give you some examples. Section 102 of the Alabama Constitution banned interracial marriage. Section 256 mandated that schools be separated along racial lines. Section 32 made an exception for involuntary servitude, an exception that was exploited to require African Americans to perform forced labor until the 1920s. And Article 8 imposed a poll tax on poor Alabamans, and the effect of this poll tax was to prevent African Americans from voting. All of these racist rules were written into the 1901 Constitution, and each of them remains written in the text of the Alabama Constitution today, on Constitution Day 2022. But here's the good news. That text is not going to be in there for much longer, because all of those texts are going to be erased as we speak right now. The Constitution of Alabama is being revised to remove that racist, hateful, exclusionary language from its text. And those changes will be truly historic when they're completed, because they'll make the Constitution more welcoming, more affirming, and they'll make the Constitution a text that, I was going to say all Alabamans, but I'm going to say most Alabamans can be proud of. And the U.S. Constitution stands in stark contrast to what's happening in Alabama, because there are just as many examples, if not more, of similarly racist and hateful and exclusionary rules still today written into the text of the U.S. Constitution. But unlike what we've seen in Alabama, there's no movement underway, nor any plausible likelihood that any of these racist rules in the U.S. Constitution will ever be erased. And the reason why goes back to 1787. That's when one of James Madison's most important proposals was decisively rejected. What was his proposal and what prompted it? I'll tell you about it in a moment, but first I want to take a detour to 12 years ago, to the powerful Tea Party movement that swept across the country and won huge victories in the 2010 midterm congressional elections in the United States. When the new Congress began its work, the Tea Party caucus called for a return to the country's roots. And what better way to do that, the Tea Party thought, than to recite the text of the original Constitution aloud in the House of Representatives. But something happened on the way to the floor of the House of Representatives as the Tea Party members began to read the text of the Constitution. They decided to omit the many words in the Constitution that authorize or perpetuate slavery, words that today remain written, though not in force. There are many vestiges of slavery, many painful reminders of the past are still visible today in the Constitution. Just an example, the 3/5 clause, which counts an enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and congressional representation. That's still in the Constitution today. The capitation clause, which requires taxation to be based on the census, which in turn is parasitic on the 3/5 clause. That's still today in the Constitution. The fugitive slave clause, which requires a return of enslaved persons who have fled to their freedom back to their captors under law. Still today in the Constitution. The importation and migration clause prohibits Congress from interfering with the international slave trade, also still in the Constitution today, along with the Electoral College and the Senate. These were the core pillars of the Constitution's infrastructure of slavery. And each of these still appears in the text of the Constitution today. Now, of course, we know that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments brought a legal end to slavery. We know that. And we know that together these constitutional reforms ushered in a new era of legal equality for all Americans, regardless of their race. But this rule of legal equality conflicts with the rule of apartheid in the constitutional text. Rules in law are important, but I don't think they have the same salience in society. Legalistic appeals to the details of jurisprudence, they just don't resonate as much as the power of emotive appeals of words and narrative. And these words of apartheid in the U.S. Constitution are quite powerful, which is why, although the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments prevail in law over the racist, hateful, exclusionary language of the Constitution, the social truth prevails in people's hearts and minds. These are stains of injustice that remain written for all to see in the Constitution. One more point about this, and I'll tell you about Madison's proposal. What makes it even worse is that the Constitution is not just written in racist language, it's written in gendered language. If you look at Article 1, Article 2, which refers to the eligibility of people to be elected president or congresspersons or senators, it refers only to he or him or his, suggesting that only a man is eligible. Now, of course, this did not stop Hillary Clinton from winning the Democratic nomination and running for president. And there's no question of law today that turns on this outdated language, gendered language in the Constitution. Women have been for a long time elected, and no one would point today to the Constitution's obsolete language as a barrier to electing a woman to any office. But the question did arise in 1916, about 100 years ago, when Jeannette Rankin became the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. At the time, the New York Times, the country's paper of record, published a letter arguing that she could not take her seat under the Constitution's rule that spoke only of men being eligible for election. Words and symbols matter. James Madison knew that. That's why he opposed the suggestion made in the first Congress of the United States to put all amendments to the Constitution at the end of the text. Ever since the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, all amendments are put at the end of the text sequentially, chronologically, leaving everything that comes before untouched, unadulterated. So when something goes in the Constitution, it stays in the Constitution, even if it's repealed by law, or even if it's repealed by a subsequent amendment. That's why the racist and sexist language appears still today in the U.S. Constitution, because of the decision made by the first Congress to append these amendments sequentially. Madison had hoped that things would have gone differently. He argued that amendments should be integrated into the original text of the Constitution. He believed that inserting amendments into the text of the Constitution would produce more clarity than a Constitution whose amendments are just put at the end of the text. And when you go into the text of the Constitution to integrate amendments, you can change the language that's there. You can erase language that doesn't fit the times anymore. The U.S. Constitution obviously did not follow the Madisonian path, but other constitutions have, such as Norway. In 1814, the original Norwegian Constitution, which exists still today, it's the same Constitution, said the following in its text, quote, "Jesuits and monastic orders shall not be tolerated. Jews are excluded from the kingdom." That's the Norwegian Constitution in 1814, still today the same Constitution. But if you look at the Constitution today, there's no hint of the hateful, exclusionary language that once appeared in the text of the Norwegian Constitution. We instead find the following language: "All inhabitants of the realm shall have the right to free exercise of their religion, and all religious and belief communities should be supported on equal terms." In other words, everyone is welcome. And that's because amendments to the Norwegian Constitution don't follow the American model, the American practice of leaving everything untouched. They instead follow the Madisonian model of integrating amendments into the text of the Constitution, just like Alabama is doing right now. So think of what the U.S. Constitution would look like if it had followed the Madisonian proposal to integrate amendments into the text of the Constitution. Some changes would have been easy to do. So the First, Third, and Fourth Amendments would probably have been inserted into Article 1 alongside other rules that restrict what Congress can do. The 14th Amendment, vast amendment, revolutionary amendment, would probably have been broken up into different parts and scattered around the Constitution. The 17th Amendment, which tells us that senators must now be directly elected, probably codified in the Constitution section on Senate elections. The constitutional rules that I told you about, the slavery protecting and enhancing rules, those would likely have been deleted after the enactment of the 13th Amendment. And so too, the rules for who can be elected probably, maybe, would have been changed. Maybe. But at least they would have thought about it after the 19th Amendment, which says you cannot have restrictions on the right to vote on the basis of sex. The point is simply this, that had Madison won the day, the Constitution that you know today would have been much different, substantially different. It would have had a different public salience in relation to historically marginalized groups like African Americans and women. And so I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised, that the Constitution of Alabama has taken this Madisonian advice. Alabama is now a leader on this front, and the U.S. Constitution lags far behind, which now brings me to my second of three questions for you. If you had been a member of the first Congress, would you have voted to adopt Madison's proposal to integrate amendments directly into the text of the Constitution? So far, we've discussed two missed opportunities. First, the opportunity to take Jefferson's advice to make the Constitution more responsive to the present needs and values of the people. And second, the opportunity to take Madison's advice to rid the Constitution of its outdated and obsolete language, as it is amended over time in ways that override earlier constitutional commitments. Both Jefferson and Madison, as you know, lost their battles. And because they lost, the Constitution is now harder to amend, and it's replete with archaic and insensitive language that holds the country back from reconciling with its past. All of this, I think, is bad. That's my second editorial point for today. Sounds very bad, and I think it actually is very bad. And yet, as bad as all of that is, the Constitution of the United States would have been even worse had Abraham Lincoln gotten his way. While Lincoln was running for president, he initiated a pivotal battle about the future of the Constitution. Lincoln desperately wanted to win this battle. But fortunately, in my view, for the country and for the world, Lincoln lost that battle. What was this battle? I want to take you back to the year 1861, just before the Civil War erupted in this country. The question at the time on everyone's mind was how to keep the peace and how to keep the South in the Union. Thomas Corwin, an elected representative, chaired a congressional committee tasked with searching for a way to diffuse the risk of civil war. Corwin came up with a solution that he thought would work. It was a solution designed to placate the South, to contain secessionist sentiment, and to avoid the bloodshed of war. And his solution was a constitutional amendment, an amendment that he hoped would calm the mounting fears of war rising across the nation. Here's the amendment he proposed. It's known as the Corwin Amendment. I'm going to read it to you. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. It's kind of hard to tell from the words of this amendment, but it's all about slavery. Every single word is about slavery. The text of that amendment was drafted shrewdly to hide its purpose in plain sight. Not at all unlike much of the rest of the Constitution, which embeds slavery deep within its architecture, but dares not speak its name. The Corwin Amendment contained 3 mutually reinforcing rules. I'm going to tell you about them. First, it legally authorized slavery across the country by giving each of the states the power to regulate, quote, the persons held to labor, unquote, within their internal borders. That phrase was code for slavery, giving each state the power to regulate its domestic institutions in relations to persons held to labor was an enticing carrot for the slave states. The states would promise to remain in the Union in exchange for the right to keep their profitable practice of slavery without having to look over their shoulder to worry about whether and when Congress would ever intrude. Second, the amendment guaranteed states the right to engage in this practice by denying Congress the power to, quote, abolish slavery or, quote, to interfere with it. So that part of the amendment compelled Congress to just keep its hands off this area of exclusive state power. And third, the amendment would become an unamendable, unalterable, permanent part of American federalism as long as the Constitution survived. So not only would the amendment deny Congress the power to abolish slavery. But the text of the amendment also shielded the amendment from any future amendment to it. That's what the text of the amendment says when it says, no amendment shall be made to this Constitution in the future to undo the Corwin Amendment. So that's the amendment proposal that Representative Thomas Corwin suggested in this congressional committee as a response to the threat of civil war in America. The most vocal supporter of the amendment was Abraham Lincoln. An amendment that prevented the Congress from interfering with slavery. An amendment that continued the states to continue with this evil sin, America's original sin of slavery. Lincoln was the most vocal supporter of this amendment. When the amendment was proposed, Lincoln had just been elected president. But he had not yet entered into office because at the time you became president on March 4th of the year after the election, not January 20th. And during this time between his election and his installation as president, he campaigned for the amendment. He didn't need to campaign. He was already elected, but he campaigned for this amendment. And he was very persuasive in campaigning for the Corwin Amendment because, thanks in no small measure to Lincoln, that amendment was approved in the Congress by a supermajority vote in both the House and the Senate, just before Lincoln entered office on March 4th, 1861. And when Lincoln delivered his inaugural address as president on that day, March 4th, he again repeated his support for that amendment. He again endorsed the Corwin Amendment. He again defended the right of states to adopt it. Now, Lincoln was not the only lawmaker, of course, to support this amendment, this hateful, evil amendment. There was a Congress that voted it up, and also Lincoln's predecessor as president, James Buchanan. He supported it too. In fact, Buchanan was such an avid supporter of the amendment that he signed the congressional proposal introducing this amendment, even though the Constitution gives the president no role in amending the Constitution. So Lincoln was far from alone in supporting the slavery-protecting amendment. But Lincoln did something that no other person did, in addition to being the most vocal and avid campaigner for it. Within 12 days of Lincoln's installation as president, Lincoln had sent a copy of this amendment that had just passed the Congress to each of the governors across the country, including the governors of those states that had seceded from the Union. And he included a personal letter with the text of the amendment, in which he noted that Buchanan had approved the amendment. This was unusual for a president to do, unusual for a president to get so deeply involved in the ratification of a constitutional amendment. But Lincoln believed profoundly in the need for this Corwin Amendment. I guess one can think of Lincoln in the following way. He believed that the twin ends of keeping the Union together and the Constitution supreme justified the means. Better to suffer evil in the nation than to lose the Republic. And so shortly after Lincoln sent his letter to the governors of every state, the states obviously began to ratify the amendment because he had asked them to do so. And it looked like the Corwin Amendment was on its way to becoming an official part of the U.S. Constitution. But before the amendment could be ratified by the required 3/4 of the states, the onset of the Civil War interrupted the march to ratification. Now, you know how the story ends. The Civil War changed the course of a nation. It also changed Lincoln's own tactics, because Lincoln stopped urging the country to adopt the Corwin Amendment when the Civil War began. And he soon thereafter issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and he then fought for an amendment, not to entrench slavery as a permanent part of the United States, but rather to abolish slavery. So that's how close the country came to having a constitution that makes slavery a permanent fixture of the Constitution. Because had the Corwin Amendment been ratified, as Lincoln wanted, it would have become the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in terms of its timing. In one of the great redemptive twists in the history of America, the actual 13th Amendment that today appears in the text of the Constitution does the opposite. It's the amendment that prohibits slavery that is now inscribed in the U.S. Constitution as a 13th Amendment. I'm going to close now only to say a couple of more things. One, it was not fated to be that the right side would win the war. But the country and the world can be thankful for all who fought for good over evil. The point is that today we think of Lincoln as the great defender of all peoples. However, I think the truth, as I've shown you, is more complicated than that. Lincoln was not an idealist, he was a pragmatist. People praise his pragmatism for saving the Union. I see things a bit differently. His pragmatism brought the country only one step away from being a slaveocracy forever and all times. That is a constitution America could have had. I'm certainly relieved that Lincoln did not get his way on the Corwin Amendment. And so my third and final question to you draws from Lincoln's vision for the Constitution. Do you think that the Constitution should make anything within it unamendable, as Lincoln proposed to do for slavery? But do you think anything should be unamendable? If yes, what would that be? So we've spoken about Jefferson and Madison and Lincoln. Each proposed a constitution that he wanted for America. Each is a constitution that America could have had, but it's of course not the constitution that America has today. Here's my last question, my fourth question to you. It's a question you have to ask yourselves, actually. Is the Constitution you have today the Constitution you want? An earlier generation of Americans confronted this question. They wanted to change their Constitution, but they couldn't do it because the Constitution was just too difficult to amend. In fact, it was impossible. I'm speaking now of America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Written in 1777, came into force in 1781. America's first Constitution had an amendment procedure that was even more difficult to use than the procedure that exists today in the U.S. Constitution. The Articles required the unanimous consent of each and every single one of the 13 states. Almost as soon as the Articles came into force in 1781, there were efforts to amend it, but every single proposal failed. This unanimity requirement just proved too onerous, too difficult. That to me sounds a lot like the current state of the U.S. Constitution. Too difficult to amend it to do the things that you want it to do for you. So that generation of Americans chose to discard that frozen Constitution, the Articles, and to write a new one. Just threw it away, wrote a new one in a revolutionary moment. The Constitution, of course, is not perfect. I've explained to you why I don't think it's perfect, but that moment was unprecedented at the time in world history. Do you think it's time to replace the ancient U.S. Constitution with a new one? 235 years is a long time. If you take all of the world's constitutions, all of them, and you figure out the average lifespan of the average constitution, you know how long it is? You know the age of the average constitution in the history of the world? 19 years. Jefferson was right. every generation, every 20 years or so is when you need to write a new constitution. You have not done that here. It's fine if you want to keep the Constitution as it is, but you should ask yourself, does it really serve the purposes that you want for it? So today on Constitution Day, do you feel like singing Happy Birthday with all of your heart? Is it right that the Constitution still today speaks in racist, gendered language and hateful and exclusionary terms? Are you satisfied with the current form of government? Are you happy with the divisive political culture that's generated by the rigid architecture of the Constitution? Are you in favor of states having the power to diminish rights of people and to create different classes of persons? I think these are the important questions to ask on Constitution Day. I hope you ask them of yourselves. As for me, I will sing Happy Birthday to the U.S. Constitution out of respect, but not out of veneration. Because the older a constitution gets, any constitution, the less it deserves blind faith, and the more I think it should invite circumspection about whether it's right for the present generation, whether it's right for the moment, and most importantly, whether it's right for you and your loved ones. Let me now close once again with thanks to Amy, to Debbie, to Amy Chain, to everyone for being here. It's been such a pleasure to have the chance to share my thoughts with you. And if there's time, I would love to hear from you and have a conversation. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was Professor Albert, so wonderful. Why don't we are at 1:30, but why don't we take just a few minutes for questions till about 1:35?
Great. Yes, please, would you just introduce yourself and shoot?
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate it. My name is Steve Anderson. Work here at Student Affairs and appreciate the opportunity to hear you. I was going to ask you, I appreciate your thoughtful questions and the way to engage us, but I think of the 20-year thing, and I was thinking of some of the countries that maybe like shift the other way. I think of what's going on maybe in some of the Eastern European countries, more conservative, locking some people out, and how do we create open societies, things of that nature. I'd be interested in because you are much more of a researcher and knowledgeable on this topic than I am, but I was thinking about that 20-year question, thinking of some of the things that we've seen around the world in some of the countries.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think my short answer is you have to take the sour with the sweet, right? So the promise of popular participation to shape the Constitution as you wish comes with risks, because not everyone will agree with you. In Chile, earlier this month, there was a referendum on a constitution they proposed. It was a constitution that would have replaced the old Pinochet constitution, an imposed constitution. Turns out that as historic as this assembly was that created the Constitution, it was historic because it was featuring gender parity. There were reserved seats for indigenous persons. Amazing. Turns out they went too far to the left. It was a constitution that was too progressive, and that's in part why it was rejected. How was it too progressive? It would have been one of the world's longest constitutions, largely because it protected so many rights. Over 100 rights were protected in that constitution, some rights that are actually not enforceable. And what happens when you put a lot of rights in the Constitution is that some people start to think, well, will the Constitution actually protect this right? Will the state actually enforce these rights? What happens when you promise too much and deliver too little is that the paper, the Constitution, the paper of the Constitution becomes less potent, less powerful. And if a constitution, as was promised in the Chilean draft, if it promises a right to housing, a right to food, a right to welfare, and you go visit Santiago and you walk down the street and you see a homeless person asking you for money or a job, you're going to call into question whether the rest of the Constitution actually means what it says. So there's a risk with trying to do too much with a constitution. So, to answer your question in one sentence, you have to take the sour with the sweet. If you want to have the power to write or rewrite your constitution, you have to accept that sometimes you might not be on the winning side. But then you get another kick at the can 20 years down the road. Time for you to build a movement, get people elected that you believe in, who believe in things that you believe in, and then to fight the battle the next time.
One more question.
Hi, and wonderful talk. I really learned a lot. Thank you. I have a question about the Corwin Amendment, and I'm sure it's just that I'm not understanding properly, so I'm hoping you can help me. If it says it can't be amended, doesn't the regular amendment clause in the Constitution permit an amendment to the clause that says it can't be amended?
So the Corwin Amendment said that it can't be amended, and you're asking, can't we nonetheless still use Article 5 of the Constitution to amend it? This would have been a challenge. This would have been a battle of interpretation of the Constitution had the Corwin Amendment been adopted. But everyone at the time understood that it was to be unamendable, right? There was no debate about whether can you use Article 5 to change it. No, people knew that this was what was proposed. Now, it could be that the 1861 people who knew that it was unamendable would have been overruled 30, 40, 50 years later, perhaps. But that would have been a clear break with the intent of those who wrote it and the understanding, not just of the congresspersons who proposed it, but of society at the time, because they knew what it meant. But I don't deny that that would have been a possibility. That might have been cheating to use Article 5 to amend an unamendable rule. You mentioned that this was the last question. Thank you so much. I want to just say thank you to Alec and Caden of the Law Review, because they will be publishing the text of these remarks. So thank you so much for that opportunity. It's a great honor to me. Thank you very much.
And before everybody leaves, we have a small gift for Professor Albert. And if you don't know, he played football in college. Also a little track, I hear, on the side. And he's a big college sports fan. So I'm going to give you this, and we're going to see if you want to open it and show everyone.
May I open it?
Yes, please.
Is it? Okay. What is it? What is it? Oh, yes. All right. Thank you. Well, thank you. This is going on my desk for sure. Oh, and there's more.
There's more, everyone.
There's more.
There's more.
Oh, a Pitt Panther football.
How
Oh, I
about
love
that?
this. I love this. I love this.
All right.
I might not have room in my carry-on for this, but I'm going to throw my other stuff out
Yeah, do
and
that.
bring this home.
Yeah. So
This is
please
amazing.
join me in thanking Richard again, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. Thank you again, everybody.
There are boxed lunches on your way out. Feel free to grab one, take them wherever you like.
All right.
Couldn't have been a better choice. I
I
love
would say
this.
that's a home run, but that's a mixed